My 30 female, husband, 30 male, had an emotional affair and I am struggling to move on. My husband and I were together for several years before getting married, and I genuinely believed our relationship was built on a solid foundation of friendship and love. He was my best friend and I really couldn't see myself being without him for the rest of my life. When I fell pregnant, we were nervous but excited. I was told by several doctors that I couldn't conceive naturally, so getting pregnant was a huge deal for me. And I had thought it was the same for my husband. But towards the end of my pregnancy, my husband started becoming withdrawn. He had just started a new job that worked long hours, and I was aware it was stressful for him in a COVID environment, so I tried to make it easy for him and give him space and lessen the burden that this pregnancy appeared to be giving him. After a few weeks on the new job, he became good friends with a female coworker. He would briefly mention her here and there in our conversations when I asked him about work, and I didn't give it much thought. We've always had friends of the opposite and we both trust each other to keep things appropriate. In my final month of pregnancy, the text messages began. From the second he stepped through the door, his phone would constantly go off. Literally every 5 seconds, he would get a notification. He would brush it off as work-related messages, and I had no reason to doubt him. He never hid his phone or acted suspiciously, but he always responded immediately to each text, often smiling as he did so. As a result, I was largely ignored at home while he stared at his phone screen throughout the night. Checking his messages was the first thing he did when he woke up and the last thing he did before he fell asleep. Whenever I tried to engage him in conversation, he'd give me a grunt of acknowledgement, his eyes never leaving the screen, his fingers replying to the latest message. There were a few times he would share something funny on his phone with me, and I would see these notifications popping up in real time. Always from his female coworker, always a message that didn't sound work-related. I never invaded his privacy and looked through his phone, but I didn't need to. Any messages I saw popping up were filled with cutesy nicknames and references to personal things. He'd quickly swipe away these notifications and pretend they weren't there, but as soon as I moved away, he'd go back to respond. When I gave birth, my husband took 2 weeks off to look after me. And he was great. He made sure I was fed, took care of all the chores, helped out with the baby whenever I needed some rest. But as soon as he had any downtime, he'd be right back on his phone. The messages never stopped. As our baby boy grew and he achieved his mini milestones, I would always delight in sharing these moments with my husband. But anytime I pointed out something cute or new, the first thing he did was take a photo and send it to his coworker, continuing on with their conversation which was clearly no longer work-related. Over Christmas, I told my husband that I was really looking forward to relaxing at home, just the two of us and the baby. I was exhausted looking after our son by myself all day every day, and couldn't wait to get some proper rest. But my husband insisted on inviting his coworker to our house for Christmas, and I was expected to cook for her and entertain her. That was the tipping point. 4 months of neglect that I had bottled up inside just exploded out. I told him how miserable he made me each night, how he had sidelined me for someone else, how he lavished attention to his coworker and barely gave me the time of day. I told him that he was having an emotional affair and I couldn't stand it anymore. To his credit, my husband was apologetic about the neglect. But he refused to admit that it was an emotional affair. Yes, he talked about personal things, yes, he constantly messaged her, yes, he shared his happiness and frustrations with her, but no, it wasn't an affair. He didn't have any physical feelings for this person, therefore I shouldn't be labeling it as an affair. And how dare I accuse him of such things? He refused to continue the conversation, and it became a long drawn-out week of silence. I cried myself to sleep every night, wondering why I wasn't good enough that my husband would find emotional comfort with someone else. Eventually he opened up after I begged him to tell me why he found me so lacking that he chose to actively ignore me. His reason was that his coworker was fun to talk to, she gave him positive reinforcement all the time. In contrast, all I gave him was negativity and stress with the baby. He admitted that he watched me do pretty much all the work with the baby, and it was just easier to lose himself with someone else than to deal with the guilt of letting me raise our child by myself. I was heartbroken. Here was my best friend of almost a decade telling me that he didn't want to be there for the bad times, only the good. That I was a weight dragging him down. It's been almost a month and I'm still struggling to come to terms with it. I alternate between being angry and sad, almost always crying myself to sleep. I feel miserable, alone, unwanted and just so exhausted. I can see my husband trying to make amends. He stopped texting her around me, but refused to set boundaries with his coworker for fear of creating a bad working relationship. He gives me a little more attention each day but it feels so forced, his moments of affection are guilt-ridden, and conversation is stilted. He doesn't want to talk about this anymore, so I will never get the closure I need. He's suggested therapy for me, but it's not something we can afford. If we keep going like this, divorce will become inevitable. I may just be overreacting to a small situation, but I can't stop feeling so horrible all the time. I'm so unhappy when he's around, but just as unhappy when he's not. Please Reddit, how can I get over this emotional hurdle and move on? Edit, thank you so much to everyone who took the time to comment and leave a message. I haven't had a chance to reply to most people, but I promise that I have read every single one. I really appreciate the kindness, the words of encouragement, and the experiences and advice everyone has shared with me. To answer, follow up on some of the common questions and themes. Why didn't I tell him sooner that it was bothering me? In the first month, I really didn't give it much thought. My husband's industry is notorious for having horrible work-life balance, so to have a constant stream of dialogue from people at work didn't seem out of the ordinary. Yes, he started ignoring me, but he's settling down in a new job, I could justify it somewhat. In the second month, it started to bother me. It was around this time that I noticed it was just one person who was constantly messaging him. I wanted to say something, but I didn't want to come across as being untrusting and demanding. I've dated jealous control freaks before, and I vowed never to be like them. By the third and fourth month, it had really cemented in for me that he was actively ignoring me for his female coworker. It was around this time that the messages became overly personal, and the frequency became so ridiculous that he'd have gone to sleep, and the notifications would still keep going, waking up the baby. I tried to start a conversation on this multiple times, but every time he'd dismiss me with a one-word answer and go back to looking at his phone. Things like "I think you're spending too much time on your phone" would be replied with "yup" and nothing more. After a while, I just gave up. I already had very little energy left in the day, why spend it talking to a brick wall? Am I actually being negative all the time? This was one of the things that hurt me the most. "You were negative and stressful" were literally the words he said to me. When I asked him to explain, it was broken down into two parts. Before the baby, I worked in a pretty entertaining place. I'd often come home with funny stories and anecdotes, and even when venting about a horrible day, it would make us giggle at the end at how common sense was just not common. When I went on maternity leave, my entire day revolved around the baby, and suddenly my stories at the end of the day were he vomited and he pooped everywhere and he didn't have his nap, so now he's extra cranky. To him, I stopped being fun and started being negative. It's not that I deliberately shared only bad things, but our baby is no angel and I can only share what I experience. The stress is a result of his guilt. He feels guilty that I let him sleep through the night, so he's alert for work, leaving me sleep deprived every day. He feels guilty that I am so patient with the baby, when he can't stand more than 10 minutes of crying. He feels guilty that I'm doing so much each day by myself that I only get time to eat one proper meal. And all of this culminates to stress from being aware of his own shortcomings. But rather than dealing with these internal emotions, he chose to punish me for it because he knew I cared enough about him that I'd be forgiving in the end. I baby-trapped him and that's why he ran to someone else. That's just not true. He was the one who really wanted to have a child. I could have lived a life with or without children. I knew children were hard work, especially for the mother, but kids were important to him, and I was willing to put in the work. But it turns out that he wasn't prepared for how difficult things could be, and so he escaped to his conversations with his coworker. Would it bother me as much if it was a male coworker? Yes, it would. My biggest issue was that I was being ignored for someone else. If he was working on a project that demanded all his free time, that would be completely different. I would understand and support him. And I have in the past. But he was free to be a husband and father whenever he came home, and he chose not to be. This wasn't a conversation between two good work friends venting about their day, blowing off steam. He's done that before, and at the end of each conversation, he'd shut off the phone and get back to home life. This was different. It was continuous, it was deep, and it took every single ounce of his attention so that the baby and I were left with nothing. The female part didn't come into play until the end, when I saw that the messages became overly personal and an extra boundary had been crossed. Look through his messages. I don't need to, it can only be worse than what I've already seen in the notifications. Why subject myself to that? Confront the female coworker. I've always believed in not blaming the third wheel. Yes, she constantly messages a married man, calls him her other half, talks about personal things, but if my husband hasn't set any boundaries, how does she know she's crossed any? Why come to Reddit if it's just going to be an echo chamber for divorce? I didn't have anyone else to talk to. I couldn't confide in friends or family because they would take sides, and it's really not fair on them. And despite how my husband has made me feel these past couple of months, I didn't want his friends to think less of him for his actions. I wanted to know if I was overreacting, if this was something I've blown out of proportion. And if it was, how do I move on? I'm really grateful to everyone for showing me that despite my husband's denial that he was doing anything wrong, things were as bad as I felt. I do want to thank the few Redditors who risked their karma to give me a different perspective, that things could be salvaged if we worked at it. Like most of the comments below, I had considered divorce. But even with divorce, it wouldn't change how worthless and unwanted he made me feel, how he still makes me feel. I want to try to heal before we go down that path. Moving on. I've come to the realization that it's not me who needs therapy, it's my husband. I tried communicating with him once more. I told him I was still deeply unhappy. He said he didn't know where I was coming from, that he thought we had hashed everything out already last time. I showed him this post, a written account of what I experienced and how I felt. His initial reaction was one of anger. I've twisted his words, I've made him out to be the bad guy, how could I share this with strangers? I asked him to show me where I've twisted things. I asked him to show me where I was being unfair. I asked him to tell me who I could have confided in otherwise that wouldn't have damaged his reputation. Things sounded twisted to him because he couldn't answer me honestly the first time round. Things sounded unfair, but it was the reality he tried to escape from. I could have been vengeful, I could have destroyed his reputation, his career prospects, but I still cared enough to protect him from the consequences. We will be separating for a while. It's a bad environment for the baby to be in. This will give him space to reflect on his actions, really figure out why he did what he did. I can't force him to change for the better, I can only hope he wants to. If he chooses to do nothing during this time, then I wish him all the best with someone else.